here gathered. And as we had requested that, to just make sure that as you come into the venue, that you try as much as possible to sit to the front of the venue so that those who come in after us can easily occupy the seats at the back. So we are starting slightly behind schedule, but we will find a way in which we are going to make sure that we still stick to the time allocated and make sure that we use your time here as allocated productively. My name is Velimbele Kasompis. Owapemba ngamakhanda madoda abanye abepemba ngomlilo. Izimzima elidle ezinye. That's my claim to fame, Prof. I'm going to be your program director for this very important occasion. And we have a very inspiring lineup of people on the program who would be sharing with us what it is they had prepared. And we are going to go into the formalities, of course, you know, where we're just going to get in the opening speeches for them to make sure that our GPS did not send us in the wrong direction, to make sure that we're in the right venue. So there are these people who should make you realize that your GPS sent you in the right direction. And without wasting much time, I wish to invite to the podium to just come and do the welcoming remarks Professor Mashau, who is the Deputy Executive Dean of the College of Human Sciences. Let's just start practicing with a round of applause.
Program Director, thank you very much for this opportunity that you are giving to me to render the welcome address on behalf of the University of South Africa and on behalf of the College of Human Sciences, which is led by Professor Nkosi. Mine is very simple. It is to make you feel at home. It is to make you feel that you are most welcome to have a conversation of this nature here at UNISA. We don't take responsibility of what you will say, but we grant you the platform and the freedom to say what you want to say without reservation. The mere fact that we are gathered today under this theme that speaks to apartheid and continued effects among blacks and whites, citizens of this country, it tells us that as much as we are in the just over the third decade of our democracy, nothing much has changed. We have the political freedom, but not the social and economic freedoms. We in charge of government, and of course, if we do not pay attention, we might even lose it soon. But in terms of the economy of the country, it still sits with the minority white. Our people are still languishing in the squalor, suffering the effects of poverty, inequality, unemployment, gender-based violence, and even the effects of the global wars that we are currently facing. the people who are most hit hard are not in the main your black diamonds, but the majority poor. Our people who use taxis and so on to work are the ones who are most affected. And it doesn't look good at all for them. And when you look at this particular topic, we need to applaud those who are running this particular project on apartheid and issues of slavery, Professor Chaka and Professor Dondon, for spearheading this particular project within the College of Human Sciences and for trying to open up this space so that we can engage critically on this uncomfortable reality. Uncomfortable reality which you normally pick when you engage the backstage talks. On the face value, we look like the rainbow nation is among us. But in reality, when you listen to the backstage talks, when blacks speak, having taken one or two, then you start to realize the deep-seated pain and suffering, the aftermath of colonialism and apartheid. And even when the whites are sitting together, then that's where the real conversation happens. The us and them conversation continues. I remember one time visiting a colleague who is a white Afrikaner, and immediately when I arrived in their space, then normally blacks are introduced as Uncle so-and-so. Uncle so-and-so is here. That day then children were told Professor Mashawi is here. They were being alerted that you need to behave differently. You can't greet the same, you can't converse the same, because the clever one has arrived, the clever black. Unlike those uncles who are cleaning our gardens and saving us, this one is different. That's the kind of backstage talks that shows that indeed we remain very much of a polarized community. Recent developments around this repeated propaganda by Donald Trump that says that white farmers are being persecuted in South Africa. It continues to repeat this story so that when he acts on it, whether his interest is on our land or whether his interest is on our minerals, we don't know. But he has vested interests, like he has shown already with Iran and other countries where he had vested interests around their oil. I don't know with South Africa what his interest is all about, but he's interested, very much interested in us. And that is why he would have opened doors to say white Afrikaners who are facing persecution here are welcome to relocate to the States. And you have your Afrikaner, your solidarity groups, AfriForum, and others, who in the main you can see that their agenda is to drag us back to apartheid, the call for Orania, the call for the Western Cape to be independent. This really shows that we remain very much a divided nation. And unless we start to reflect on the past to deconstruct the current state of affairs and reshape the future. And we as the College of Human Sciences are a very critical interlocutor because in the main, we are not apologetic when we talk issues around decolonialization and Africanization. We are here in order to recenter the African indigenous knowledge systems, even in shaping our curriculum. We don't want the curriculum that reflects the West. Just like Yoviani Velem will say, we have to unthink the West in order to move forward. And this is the hour and the time. I want to welcome all the interlocutors who have been invited to come and engage us. And we are looking forward to the fruitful engagement. I welcome Professor Dondolo, Professor Chaka, Mr. Nawa from the Department of Sports and Culture here in Gauteng. Welcome Professor Mudiri, welcome Prof. Dadla, welcome Dr. Masinga, and indeed Mr. Mbele, who will be facilitating the conversation. We are looking forward to a great night where an iron sharpens an iron. As and when I pause to sit down, let me also apologize on behalf of Professor Chaka and Professor Dondolo. They do have a budget. They do have a lucrative budget for this particular project. Unfortunately, they were failed by those who work around the logistics in terms of ensuring that everything is okay. So, unfortunately, we won't show our humanity, our ubuntu, by sharing a meal with you tonight. It's just unfortunate. We'll correct that in the future. So our apologies. So our apologies that we won't be able to serve you even water. This is very unfortunate, Prof. Chaka. But we do understand that sometimes when you're working with people, we do fail here and there. Not because we don't have cash. We do have cash here at UNISA. That's why everybody's interested in this project. Thank you very much and a hearty welcome.
So, thanks so much, Prof. Mashao. So, you know, I was a bit fuzzy about what do the KRAs of a deal include, you know. So, but when you the way you dealt with the issue of FAU, I then understood also that that is part of your KRAs as well. And we appreciate the fact that you had the decency and the respect, you know, to the audience, that the people you've invited to explain that. Because other people would have dealt with it differently. We really appreciate that you've done that. From some of the people I also know in the audience, I don't think their participation is going to be affected by that announcement, you know. It might actually just inspire them more, but we appreciate the words of welcome. And you've also made it very easy for the speakers as well, you know, in terms of dealing with areas that are usually intellectual no-go areas. You know, you went into those areas with ease. So we expect even more from our honorable panel. But let's use this opportunity now to get one of the co-founders. If it's not Dr. Chaka, Prof. Chaka, he will indicate, to just come and give us a background on what informed this project. Can we usher him also to the podium?
Thank you, Mr. Mbele. Good evening. I almost said brothers and sisters, but anyway, since I've said it, brothers and sisters. I want to apologize on behalf of my co-convener, Prof. Dondolo, who was supposed to speak on this matter. But just briefly, so that we don't really take much of your time. This is a project that has been a long time coming. And every time when I do speak of this project, I always like to reference my colleague and my brother, Ndumiso Tlatla, because there were a lot of nights and days that we sat together trying to conceptualize this. And so the reason why it is still just a project and not a center or an institute is because we are yet to find agreement within the university community about whether or not the nomenclature in this project are appropriate. There are, of course, some people who would want to see different wording in that it might attract proper funding, and believing that sometimes when you mention issues like colonialism and apartheid and slavery, you are chasing money away. But I am of the view that perhaps it is about time that when we look at a phenomenon such as apartheid, which when compared to the Holocaust, for instance, is one of those words that stand out. And yet, this one remained very much understudied, even in a context where it continues to impact the lives of both black and white in this country. And so that is, I think, just one of the reasons why we are here, and why I hope that we will still continue to get lots of buy-in as to maybe dreaming of an institute or a center one day where we'll be investigating and studying this phenomena across the disciplines. And so you'll also see in today's program, we have invited colleagues across the disciplines, not only in the social sciences and in the humanities, but across the disciplines, because we do believe that the issues of disciplines are also man-made. And in a way, they prevent us from really finding all the solutions that we can have towards helping and bettering our communities. And so I'm hoping that today's conversation at least will be one installment in that direction of making sure that this is a conversation that is intra, trans, and multidisciplinary, so that we do get all the help that we require to make sure that these issues get the attention that they need in our communities. With that said, I thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and I hand the platform back to you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Chaka. It's difficult to undo your training. So when you said brothers and sisters, you were just reflecting something that's called programming, you know? Yeah, it's difficult to undo your training. Right. So before we go into our speakers, right, we want to add, Prof, and also just throw the cat amongst the pigeons as well. So building on the solid background that has been provided by Professor Chaka, this dialogue is not only profoundly timely, but it is also a commendable act of courage in an era in which intellectual cowardice and conformism have become new forms of celebrity. Often the concept of apartheid is not mentioned in relation or alongside colonialism, slavery, or even genocide. Equally, the concepts of Holocaust and genocide are rarely used in relation to the experiences of African people. And this is perhaps why, in their wisdom, the originators of this program decided to insert the word Afrocentric in naming this project, which I suspect is intended to center the experiences of the African body in the work of this project. Secondly, as a result of this obscurantism I referred to, moments such as the transatlantic slavery and the trans-Sahara slave trade don't feature prominently in so-called mainstream discourses about the genocide and the Holocaust, which also explains why there is rarely any meaningful political or academic discussion on two of the first major genocides of the 19th and 20th century, the Congo genocide of 1885 to 1908, and the Namibian genocide of 1904 to 1909. It also helps us to understand why the Jewish Museum's projects across over 168 institutions globally, which include 42 in the United States, 29 in Israel, 17 in Germany, and why there is the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, which operates 3 centers in South Africa, in Cape Town, in Durban, and in Johannesburg. Lastly, today's dialogue takes place against the backdrop of a number of moments in our national life as a country and people. As already stated, the 32nd anniversary of the Declaration of Political Independence, and I'm very pedantic, between independence and its declaration, the two are not the same. The 30th anniversary of the adoption of the South African Constitution, the challenges of post-independence reconstruction in the form of access to relevant decolonized education, and the persistence of gendered, racialized, and spatialized inequality. This dialogue also takes place in the context of South Africa's case against the Zionist entity of Israel at the International Court of Justice, and as you have indicated, the backlash that includes the very bizarre claims of genocide against the descendants of the Dutch. In the context of all of this and more, the question under discussion today is apartheid, its continued effects on both black and white lives in present-day South Africa. With those words, it is now my honor and privilege to invite to the podium our first presenter, Dr. Nkaseko Masinga, who is a number of things, but is also known as a health humanities scholar, as we usher her to the podium.
Himina Nkateko, ngwana wa Chabuyo na Kazamula, Kazamula wa Muhlaba, Muhlaba wa Jim, Jim wa Stota, Stota wa Nkanyabane, Nkanyabane wa Bushani, Bushani wa Choki, Choki wa Ngunola, Ngunola wa Masingi. Hena aka hena he tinzuba leto ja madzovo. Aye. Greetings, colleagues. I am so honored to be here. You know, when there is an occasion that you're supposed to show up for, it's as if you're in that video game where you have to pass certain challenges in order to earn the prize. And for me, the prize was being able to show up fully. And I feel like there were all of these challenges in the way, but as soon as one thing was resolved, I knew that I'm one step closer to being here. So I'm so honored to be in front of you. And I am so grateful that each of you, I know that the reality I spoke of does not just apply to me, that each of you had to go through considerable challenges in order to be able to be here. And I'm really grateful that you overcame each and every one of those. I'm very happy to see you this evening. I'd like to begin with an excerpt from my work in progress, which is titled Semantics of Living. So this is a poem titled Anatomy. I trudge along the mortuary hall, my mentor's words echoing through my psyche as formaldehyde assaults my nostrils. Vicks skulks out from my scrub's leg pocket. Camphor, menthol, eucalyptus. Brief respite from the inexorable smell of flesh. This day has declared me defeated, unfit to survive the rigor of the field that we come to by forceps or by fate. The field that converts cum laude to Hail Mary without grace. The field that offers me a body in exchange for my name inscribed on a plaque. Geriatrics was light work in comparison to this. Obstetrics was doable if you set aside the incessant bleeding. Forensic pathology was a harbinger, the baptist to my reign of ruin and redemption. But this, scalpels wielded to the sound of corpses breaking, a clavichord choir of sternums cracking, to uncage the heart of man, the conductor of a once clamorous orchestra, now stilled for eternity. I retrieve the blade from my dissection kit. One incision contributes one mark. And nightly I will walk these halls again, again, again. Had I known the cost, I would have sprinted with my soul. That piece was written in honor of all of the unclaimed, unidentified, and unnamed bodies in institutional dissection halls. It is a fact that the unclaimed bodies which are used for cadaveric dissection in medical training programs are disproportionately those of poor, marginalized, and Black people, without the knowledge or consent of their families. This acquisition of bodies is legal under the National Health Act of 2003. However, legality does not equal morality. And it is in this vein that I pose a question. Is the acquisition and dissection of unclaimed bodies a second assault on those who have already suffered the indignities of anti-Black racial violence in their lifetime? In order to answer that question, I would like us to examine In the Wake on Blackness and Being, the seminal work of Christina Sharp, published in 2016 by Duke University Press. In this book, Sharp introduces wake work, or being in the wake, as the processes involved when we plot, map, and reflect on the archives of everyday Black life and Black death. She asks, in the midst of so much death and the fact of Black life as proximate to death, how do we attend to physical, social, and figurative death, and also to the largeness that is Black life? Black life that is insisted from death. I believe that we are called to our own version of wake work, because being in the wake of apartheid means that we are uniquely positioned to examine its limbs, that we are awake to the contents of its uncaged heart, and that we continue to keep watch over the body of our collective consciousness. We are called to the proverbial dissection hall so that we can bear witness and see in whose hand the blade lies. Let us also examine the racial contract by the late Charles W. Mills, published in 1997 by Cornell University Press. In this book, Mills argues that the racial contract was never a true contract because the absence of consent negated its validity. In an article titled Understanding Apartheid South Africa Through the Racial Contract, published in 2015 by the International Journal of Asian Social Sciences, the scholars Mavis Mhlauli, Enid Salani, and Rosina Mukotedi from the University of Botswana quoted Mills as follows: if the racial contract creates its signatories, meaning those who are party to the contract, by constructing them as white persons, then it also makes its victims, who are the objects of the contract, into the non-white sub-persons that it specifies. Mhlauli, Salani, and Mukotedi further assert that the contract was voided at its onset because white people, who are referred to as humans or persons, never had a legitimate agreement with the non-whites, who, in the words of Mills, were denied the status of being human, marked by the exploitation of their bodies, their land, and their resources, and the denial of equal social, economic opportunities to them. So if we juxtapose the orthography of the wake, which is the key concept in this book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being by Christina Sharp, with the non-consensual nature of the racial contract, which is underpinned by white supremacy, which Mills refers to as a deliberate political system, then I believe that we can reasonably assume that systems that oppress Black life predict and complicate Black death. And so I would like to expand on my question as follows. If the acquisition and dissection of unclaimed bodies is a second assault on those who have already suffered the indignities of anti-Black racial violence in their lifetimes, is it possible that the existence of bodies acquired by other means, including body donor programs, create a hierarchy within the dissection hall based on the ability to consent, whether by choice or by proxy, a privilege which is not accessible to the unclaimed, unidentified, and unnamed? Where that question comes from is, while I was doing my research for this, I found out that the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Cape Town has cadaver memorialization. Am I saying it right? They memorialize the cadavers. And there was something that touched me when I saw that, because they invited the families of the body donors. And I was thinking about all of the people who died and their families had no idea where they were, and how it is so difficult to pay tribute to them in the same way, because I feel as if their space in there is so different. At the University of Pretoria, prior to dissection, we had a priest come in and explain to us what it means that you are now working with and from the body of someone who might not have been able to agree to this. And there was something very painful about that entire 7 weeks that we were dissecting, because I had to then contend with the fact that if this person were alive, this is possibly not what they would have wanted. So as we reflect on the question that I posed before I digressed, I'd like to share another poem from my work in progress. This one is titled, "A Firefly at the Communion Table." I acknowledge that I am no martyr. I falter through the Our Father. I remember well the cracked cadaver that I dissected. The man had a name once, and then only a tag on his foot, barcoded property of the institution. I acknowledge that I am no hero. I threaten the throat of memory with this admission. I nearly died in medical school. I had a name then too, and then only debt and illness, labeled property of the institution. I acknowledge that I am no saint. I give the kisses. I take the silver. I flutter for a chance at living, a firefly at the communion table. And so we are gathered here at the proverbial communion table in the wake of apartheid, but also in the wake of the commemoration of Freedom Day, which was yesterday. And I'm reminded of the words of Professor Lwazi Lushaba, who was at the previous iteration of this seminar in April of 2024. And he said the following: the 27th of April is not Freedom Day, it is Independence Day. But because the category that we use to think about our history is given to us, then we are left with a misrepresentation of our own lived experience. If you can control the categories with which people think about history, then you can leave them uncertain of when they became independent. So that really stayed with me. And it brings me to my third question. Is it possible that the legality of the act of acquiring unclaimed bodies for use in dissection halls is a remnant of slavery? In 2023, an article titled "From Grave Robbing to Giving Your Body to Science, a Short History of Where Medical Schools Get Their Cadavers." Two medical historians, Sarah Lawrence and Sarah Ladera, from the University of Tennessee and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, respectively, wrote that the very first anatomy law was passed in 1831, making the bodies of poor people available for dissection. This legislation came about in the wake of body trafficking controversy, in which grave robbers were basically stealing bodies and then selling them to institutions that need them. And they referred to themselves as resurrectionists. In an article titled "In Need of Cadavers, 19th Century Medical Students Raided Graves," published in 2018 in Smithsonian Magazine, Antero Pietila wrote the following: "This pillaging of bodies, although technically a misdemeanor, was seldom prosecuted. Politicians protected it in the name of common good, and the police looked the other way. Lawyers argued that because the previous occupant had vacated the body, its citizenship was in doubt, its ownership was in doubt, so why bother? There was no victim after all." In South Africa, our land, where we live and strive for freedom, the National Health Act of 2003 states the following: "If a body has not, within 30 days after the death of the deceased, been buried, it shall be at the disposal of the officer in whose area the body is located. The health officer may, on receipt of a written notice, hand the body over to a specific institution situated in the area of the health officer. The person in charge of an institution in which a body has been handed over shall keep and preserve that body for a period of no longer than 14 days before it may be used. Any tissue of such a body may be removed and preserved separately." And we have to remember that this is a human being that is being spoken about. The body was someone's relative. In September of 2024, the Department of Health, the South African National Department of Health, had a meeting with the Portfolio Committee where they were responding to the Health Market Inquiry report on the status of unclaimed bodies in state mortuaries. The meeting so there was a session in which all of the facts were being presented. The fact that there are too many unclaimed bodies, and there are a lot of unclaimed bodies of people who are not South African citizens. So to be frank, the bodies, the cadavers that we find in our medical school dissection programs are usually the bodies of people who died on the street. No one knows who this person is. There's no way of tracking down the family. And so according to the law, according to the Health Act, then they can be used. And I find it really, really sad, because there's something about medicine that depersonalizes things. Everyone becomes a number. Everyone is just hospital number, whoever, bed number, whoever. And you forget that that's a human being. And even after they've passed away, that is a human being. So within this meeting, it was acknowledged that this acquisition of unclaimed bodies is taboo within traditional African culture. It is taboo, and there was no system in place to track the bodies of deceased people. And so they justified the fact that there are a certain number of days that you can keep a body. And there are a certain number of days that you can store a body before you start to use it. And that's usually what happens, is even if some people come and look for the relative a year later, 2 years later, by then it's too late. And so the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee then made different recommendations, one of them calling for collaboration across various sectors, including the police department, the justice department, and the home affairs department. And these recommendations were that there should be more comprehensive solutions to the number of bodies that are currently in dissection halls, how to deal with the systemic issues surrounding unclaimed bodies. And so I'd like to leave you with one last question. In light of all that we have spoken about, to whom does your body belong? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. No, you really stretched us cognitively and epistemically. But you did it very beautifully and elegantly as well, you know. I like the way you walked us through. And there was also a nice play on the concept of the afterlife of slavery. Saidiya Hartman's concept of the afterlife of slavery. I heard how beautifully you also stretch that. But I'll leave that to the audience to engage you. But what you also did beautifully was that you ushered in our next speaker beautifully, you know, because he comes from the perspective of law, right? So you asked very interesting questions about the law, right? Which then gives me the privilege to invite our next speaker, Professor Joel Mudiri, who is a scholar of jurisprudence. If we can usher him to the podium, please.
Okay, good evening. Give a greeting in the cultural lineage. Man. I guess out here go pay, so I suppose the greeting from where I come from is Eitada. Thank you very much. I want to do a few things. Let me start by thanking you, Prof. Chaka, for the invitation to reflect on this problem that several of us have been working on, and to my fellow speakers for being part of this conversation, as well as yourself, Mr. Program Director. I want to start, of course, by just amending or tweaking the framing of today's event. Of course, we speak of the afterlife of colonial apartheid because we want to keep into view the long durée of the colonial problematic as a problem of colonial conquest set in motion from the 1600s up to now. And so what we are talking about is not just the afterlife, of course, of apartheid, but the afterlife of colonial apartheid, which is a small point that binds this long history of the making of South Africa for our purposes. The second thing is that despite my billing as a scholar of law, which I am, I have long been thinking of my work belonging to jurisprudence. And I have, in my own work, elaborated the notion of jurisprudence as an anti-disciplinary location. I see, like, Mafeje people here, you know, we got it from him many years ago, that the true social critique proceeds by being anti-disciplinary, refusing the boundedness of these constructed knowledge categories. What I'm going to talk about tonight is work that I've been working on under the sign of anti-colonial jurisprudence. I'm going to just read some of what I want to offer with the hope that it captures what I think my work for the past decade and a bit has been about, which has been to argue that the state of black people's lives, the state of black people's material lives, and the state of black people's inner lives remains for all of us the fundamental conceptual and political emergency of our times. I will have very little to say about white lives, such as to say that white lives are implicated in the problem that I'm going to talk about. This project on anti-colonial jurisprudence takes its bearings from Cedric Robinson's description of black radicalism as a negation of Western civilization, what he also calls the striving to make history in our own terms. This conceptual insurgency has been the motivating driver for the work that we have been doing, work that has traveled under the sign of Azanian political thought, but also work that we might also call constitutional abolitionism, which is a call, an intellectual call for a different relationship to the political and present constitutional order, a relation that should be marked not by constitutional worship and liberal consensus, but by subversion and refusal. The ethical and political challenge that we have been putting together as a community of black scholars is to interrogate and to undo the premises of post-1994 constitutional democracy by pressing on the unresolved problem of historical and corrective justice, by pressing on the ongoing reality of white economic, social, and cultural supremacy in the present, and by insisting that the material and symbolic force of race and racism must be reckoned with. If white supremacy is understood as itself a dynamic historical political system and an ideology that structures the field of political, economic, social, legal, psychic, and spatial life, then this would unmask the proper constitutional basis of South Africa. Colonial apartheid, or say Jim Crow, are simply permutations of white supremacy and not exhaustive archetypes of its expression. What comes after apartheid is apartheid 2.0. The critical negative founding assumptions of black radical thought, especially those enunciated through critical race theory, have already tutored us in the problem of the continuance, resilience, and variability of white supremacy beyond the image of a white authoritarian government or a vulgar, overt bigot. The precise conceptual challenge that we are faced with in South Africa is to map out and narrate the problem of white supremacy continuing under black political rule. Insofar as the South African reality retains the key elements of colonial apartheid, namely the economic and social superordination of whites, the valorization of Western civilization and its paradigms of order, we nonetheless remain caught up in what we might now call, contra Marx, the relations of conquest. And if white supremacy remains the living and structuring political order of our day, then the space of the black liberation struggle cannot reach constitutional closure or conciliation. This makes celebrations of days like Freedom Day at least obscene, since it sells a defeat as a triumph. This brings into crisis the entire Congress or CODESA model of a liberal reformist configuration of the political order and community that is built upon the political naturalization of settler colonialism and the pragmatic accommodation of historical oppressors and their unjustly acquired entitlements, while presuming to defer the redress and reparations that is necessary to make the coming of a new order meaningful and tenable in the first place. Whether you call this problem political democracy without economic democracy, whether you call it democratization without decolonization, or whether you call it flag freedom, this model of change that was adopted in South Africa ends up, we now see, largely preserving colonial apartheid power relations, institutional and epistemic forms and value systems, while also spawning new and virulent neo-colonial disorders. Even if one were to defend South Africa's disjointed and compromised constitutional democracy as the only correct or inevitable path of historical change, this could hardly explain away the problem that it is the black majority that continues to carry the excessive costs of this limping, defective sovereignty. Other scholars working outside but alongside the black radical tradition, scholars working in the Marxian political economy school, scholars like John Saul, has described the South African transition as an instance of recolonization by global capital, which entrenched the social and economic unfreedom of the black majority. Saul argues that the recolonization, he sometimes uses the word false decolonization or false liberation, was the outcome of what he calls the limited conception of liberation that was held by the architects of the new South Africa. Because it focused, argues, on the deracialization of the existing institution, on advancing white and black political and social elites, and on black people gaining what is called administrative power, which is no power at all if it does not have social, economic, and cultural backing. The spirit of this critique reminds me and takes me back to an episode of black political heresy, which I'd like to talk about now. A black political heresy acted out principally through the figure of Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe and the dissension in the late 1950s against the proto-constitutional Kliptown Charter and its central motif, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. That's the trauma of the title, Prof. When you say black and white, it reminds me of this ruse. Sobukwe and his Azanian comrades protested the Charter's disavowal and non-resolution of the historical antagonism of colonial conquest, white racism, and settler colonialism. He saw the Freedom Charter, therefore, as a definitive instance of what Sarah Ahmed has called the non-performativity of anti-racism, where anti-racism does not do what it promises, that is, to negate racism. In his re-inauguration of the Africanist insurgency against South Africa, Sobukwe objected to the multiracial ideological protocols of the Charter, highlighting that it is, quote unquote, in fact pandering to the European bigotry and arrogance. and that it functioned, he said, as a method of safeguarding white interests. Listening to Sobukwe from 2026 seems like encountering a prophecy. More profoundly, Sobukwe premised the Africanist rejection of multiracialism on explicitly forward-looking concerns, namely that maintaining rather than dissolving the racial ideology of colonial apartheid and the subject positions it created would amount to, he said, transporting into the new Africa these very antagonisms and conflicts. The struggle to, quote-unquote, again, overthrow white supremacy, as Sobukwe conceptualized it, was built on three essential principles. Three essential principles which he argued that the Charterists negated. Firstly, that the colonial problematic in South Africa instantiated what he called the twin problems of land and status. Land and status, a loaded formulation registering a struggle to restore and reanimate African personality and sovereignty across the entire gamut of political, economic, social, cultural, psychological, and spiritual life. The second principle undergirding Sobukwe's Africanist insurgency was his argument that true democracy in South Africa can only be established in South Africa and on the continent as a whole only when white supremacy has been destroyed, not accommodated, not compromised with, destroyed. And thirdly, Sobukwe postulated that it would be the collective masses of African people who were the primary revolutionary historical subject, the key and center and content in the anti-colonial struggle. The course of this total war against white domination, what Sobukwe described as the fight against the whole concept of white supremacy, led for him and the Africanists before him to a confrontation with the de-radicalizing presence of white liberals and leftists in the liberation struggle, a presence that at once reinscribed white racial paternalism and privilege, imposed Western liberal and Marxist formulas on an irreducibly African political milieu, and blocked the formation of a radical, authenticating political agency. Sobukwe, in search of a different political imagination, drew instead from the long tradition of African nationalism and Pan-Africanism to articulate another emancipatory political constitutional vision of liberation. This one would be marked by a liberatory non-racialism that rejected both the racialism of apartheid and the liberal multiracialism of anti-apartheid. His was a vision for what he called an Africanist socialist democracy that deprecated totalitarianism and economic exploitation. For Sobukwe, the scientific and moral truism that there is only one race, the human race, demanded precisely the dismantling of white supremacy and the termination of the settler colonial order, and not their accommodation through compromise. By reworking non-racialism into a principle of non-domination, and by reworking the notion of democracy into a vision of collective political, economic, and cultural self-determination, Sobukwe insisted on the concrete, material realization of unencumbered material and spiritual freedom for the oppressed. He argued that this would be a precondition for, not merely an aspiration of, a liberated society. Put in clearer terms, Sobukwe postulates an anti-colonial rather than integrationist conception of self-determination. His view is that what was required was the abolition of colonial sovereignty, not its preservation through constitutional law. The most damning implication of Sobukwe's critique is that by protecting white people's racial interests in property and general social power, and by shielding the beneficiaries of colonial apartheid from full collective responsibility and accountability, the multiracialism of the Congress movement not only betrayed its own alleged non-racialism, but it became the vehicle for the transmutation of white supremacy into constitutional democracy. We might view this, therefore, as the perfection of conquest, in the same sense that Anthony Sfali spoke of the perfection of slavery. As Sfali writes, the slave perfects itself as a slave when it bows down before the master of its own free will. That is the moment in which the slave accomplishes the impossible reconciliation of its freedom with its unfreedom by willing itself unfree. When exactly Farley continues, does this perfection of slavery take place? It takes place, Farley says, when the slave bows down before its master, when it prays for legal relief, when it prays for equal rights, and while it cultivates the field of law, hoping for an answer. This avowedly anti-revolutionary imaginary of change comes in the sense, therefore, to betoken a certain fatalism about the possibility of another world. That is to say that the new political order by which we now live has accepted, in fact, that it will be or remains impossible for African people to imagine a truly non-racial political and economic democracy. This is what the PAC rebels who were acting on the Ubuntu prescript that ethics precedes politics, this is what they meant when they argued that the charterist turn of their former ANC Youth League comrades in fact amounts to the total abandonment of the liberation struggle as such. So that one historical account would argue that the ANC was, strictly speaking, not a nationalist movement for national liberation and independence, but a movement for the protection of democratic rights for African people within a multiracial state. We cannot and will not reckon with the problem of white supremacy if we do not also reckon with the failure of our liberators to liberate us. Sobukwe's articulation of this Africanist insurgency seems important to recount this evening because it provides a powerful counter-statement to the constitutional worship that we now see in South Africa. He anticipated that the adoption of a new constitution that does not set in motion a thoroughgoing reconstitution of the social, economic, and political foundations of South Africa would only leave us with worldless and unrepaired subject positions and subjectivities, and also leave us even more so with a violent social reality relentlessly partitioned by the terror of the color line. It seems that we are now in the horrors that Sobukwe and the Africanists imagined, one in which we would be the source of our own unfreedom. Thank you.
Our presenters, exactly. Our presenters don't, you know, and one of the key messages that come out here, Prof. Mudiri, you are questioning our very conception of freedom, you know, our very conception of freedom and what it means to be free from the perspective of our existential reality of African people. And in the process, of course, you speak about how we just kneel at the feet of the Constitution, you know. Yeah, so that is it. So that now opens the way for our next presenter, Prof. Ndumiso Dladla, who goes by many other, you know, titles, and for the purposes of this discussion, he is called a philosopher.
Okay, Sanbonane. Yeah, no, all of us are reflecting the places we think from these days. These days, I think from a small coastal village in KwaZulu, not Natal, called Mthunzini, which actually is a site in the history of our people of an old betrayal to King Cetshwayo by a fellow named John Donne, who he had given this land with the idea that he would assist the Zulu kingdom in its dealings with the English from the foreknowledge of English culture and warfare. And uDonne took amakhosikazi wakwaZulu, numbering more than 50. So he had Zulu descendants, but at the opportune moment, he sided with the British and assisted them against uCetshwayo. dealing a serious blow to the optimism in the history of non-racialism. Anyway, that is just a historical anecdote. I will begin with my discussion. These are really just a loose set of notes, quite anti-disciplinary in the way that they are structured, on the problem of apartheid. Even the many hats I wear are shown by the jumping around between faculties, which if you look at my resume, my official employment has moved from different faculties over the last couple of years. But I've been preoccupied with the same basic problems, even though, and I've applied the same set of methods, but of course, the problems themselves show themselves to have multiple faces. So the first thing I want to say is that apartheid is often, it makes up part of the common sense of the South African thinking and vocabulary, but much spoken about and memorialized, it appears to be little understood. Now, I'm going to be suggesting that we ought to see apartheid as what Michel Foucault described as an episteme, a guiding unconsciousness of our epoch, which creates boundaries in intellection, in our ability to think through problems. So, if you might understand its ideological status, it's a kind of apparatus that forces us to see problems within certain parameters, and therefore it foregrounds the very possibility condition of questions we can ask about a problem. So let me try to be more explicit and precise. Imagine, I suppose I teach philosophy students lately, so let's use an old example from Plato's Cave, which I think Professor Klute will enjoy. But imagine that you have somebody entrapped facing a particular position, and their notion of reality is the parameters which you set their face at seeing. This is to say that reality itself encompasses a much larger range, geometrically and materially. But because they are positioned in relation to the object and constrained by a set of obstacles which they are unable to see, the possibility even of asking questions about their conditions of seeing are structured by this apparatus. Do I make any sense? Do you understand me? Okay, so I wish for us to think of apartheid precisely as such a constraining mechanism, which has passed for reality itself in the description which we have received from our forebearers about what we are living through, okay? Now, the point which I wish to make is that this particular apparatus is not invented by black people. It is not an object, an artifact which arises from the intellectual tradition of the indigenous conquered people to frame the nature of the problem as apartheid. It is received. It's a received constraint which some political traditions, which sometimes are described as belonging to us, as being the oldest liberation, this and that on the continent, have taken this as part of its common sense. But I'm suggesting to you that this is not part of the common sense of black people themselves, okay? From a technical, historical point of view, apartheid merely describes the policy framework of the National Party after their victory in the 1948 elections and the series of legislations which they wrote, which were preoccupied with the notion in civilizational studies of separate development. But if you study the history of South Africa, even in its social policy, you'll see that even the Boers didn't invent this particular way of social organization. Historical records of South African history typically describe the period prior to apartheid, with a synonym for apartheid in English, segregationism. This is the segregationist phase after the unification of the country. So the idea that some catastrophe took place in 1948 that fundamentally changed the terms of order is certainly not something which arises from the black intellectual tradition. But some blacks, of course, have imbibed this and convinced themselves and others that it is us who see this problem as apartheid. Now, in recent times, I suppose that it's become quite popular even amongst the black intelligentsia to make the concession that the optimism which attended to the transitional period and the description post-apartheid was not particularly accurate for the description of the historical reality. So we have had various descriptions, neo-apartheid, even another person who decided the Latin was too much and decided to recoin it in English and called it the new apartheid. Indeed, another dear brother of ours suggested that novelty was not enough of a condition to describe what was happening and decided that what is happening now, in fact, given the intensification of inequality, is best described as hyper-apartheid. But all of this is apartheid mania. It is still captured by the same apparatus. These people are still trapped in the same intellectual prison of being unable to penetrate their basic strictures. They have not broken the apparatus that has constrained them to conceive. They are still thinking in relation to this basic foreign formulation of the problem as apartheid, which I insist again is not our understanding of the problem. Now, apartheid also introduces confusion in black thinking about their political past. For instance, if one follows discussions on social media, you'll see black people quite befuddled by the idea that Helen Zille, now generally understood to be a conservative, though she goes by classic liberal, who's known to swim in potholes from time to time, was indeed in the past an anti-apartheid activist. Now this is what happened to Helen. I'm here to tell you nothing happened to Helen. This is perfectly explicable. It requires no major theory to understand. The Oppenheimer family was also anti-apartheid. In fact, they were so anti-apartheid, they provided the funds for the beginning of the Progressive Party, of which Helen Zille was a member. But Biko gives us a clue about this. He says, I think the essay is We Blacks. He says, you know, the biggest mistake that the black world ever made was to assume that whoever was against apartheid was an ally of the blacks. There we go. Now the point is that you can be anti-apartheid and be white supremacist. There's no contradiction. White business was anti-apartheid from the middle of the 20th century, and it's because all of their economists suggested that apartheid was economically costly. One of their great historians, a woman who then got married, so she writes under two different names, their husband name and her own maiden name. Her name is Merle Lipton, but I think at the time she was Merle Boalo. She wrote a book called Capitalism and Apartheid. Now, the basic liberal consensus was that by this reservation of special jobs for whites, the capitalists of South Africa could not fully benefit from the exploitation of black labor, which was widely available. And so their profit margins were affected. And then, of course, there was the stigma of a recognized white supremacist polity, which, if it was normalized as a democracy, while maintaining the basic same exploitative pattern, would allow for them to trade their goods without the stigma of being white supremacists while enjoying white supremacy. So they began to fund a project to bring an end to this, which, contrary to Biko's very important warning, many people ignored. They ignored this in part, of course, because the Congress movement, unlike the Black Consciousness movement or the PAC, which make up part of the Azanian tradition, were indeed anti-apartheid parties. They explicitly facilitated and partook in the international campaign of anti-apartheid movements. And this lent a legitimacy that a voice from inside the country itself understood the basic terms of order in the same way. Now, the function of apartheid for the global white supremacist imagination is wonderful. It provides an exception, an aberration from normal white supremacy. If you study cinema during the period of apartheid from the 60s, you see that one of the figures, you know the Hollywood villain when he is white is often a special white associated with an evil which is unwhitely. The German after 1945 is a typical figure of a villain because of Nazism. The Russian terrorist is a typical figure of villainy, even though white, because of the Cold War and the threat of communism. But the Boer also became part and parcel of the imagination of an exceptional aberration to whiteness. If you don't believe me, you know, there's a white Afrikaans film star named Arnold Vosloo. Those of us who watched Jean-Claude Van Damme's Ama film ga Van Damme remember Andre Vosloo as a person who was always there playing a Hollywood villain. If you study Black Panther, a recent supposedly pro-black imperialist film, you see Black Panther, the Black Panther. If you see Wakanda, you see there as well. One of the figures of the villain is an Afrikaner from, you know. So the point is that this aberration is also imputed to other whites within the United States, because the cinema is really a preserve of the propaganda mediums of the northerners, the liberals. The southerner is the one who is portrayed as the racist, as the archetype of the racist. Get off my land. We understand the typical figuration of a particular kind of stupid, dim-witted white person who is not like the white person par excellence. Now, the function of the Boer as the white responsible for apartheid, in fact, you know, when Malema was first charged with singing Tubulipun, one of the white liberals, Terry Bell, wrote a defense to say, no, he's not talking about us. We sang this song as well, you know. We know who he's talking about. He's talking about Amapunu. And the precise point of the PAC, following Malcolm X and a long tradition of black radicals, is the only good white man is a dead one. And it's a very simple point, that the idea of abstracting whiteness from white person is a complete fabrication of theory. There is, you know, so the point is that it's white people themselves that have to be abolished. This is not a, you know, we can discuss the content of this point, but the point of all of this is exactly that this stratification, and Biko makes precisely the same point, you know. In making this point, he makes a very similar kind of insight, that it's of nuisance value to blacks to obsess over good whites and bad whites instead of fighting white supremacy. Once white supremacy comes to an end, there'll be no need for this discussion. So the point is that apartheid then becomes a structural phenomenon associated with bad whiteness, which serves the good whites the most. If you see the ink that was spilled during the historical debates between the neo-Marxists, the liberals and conservatives, you see that the function of apartheid in this international discourse was a kind of blame it on the Boers, so that the English-speaking whites, with the aid of the international press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, could produce for themselves a distance from white supremacy, blaming it on what in the US by a similar kind was the South. It's the Southerners that want slavery, the Northerners are liberal. In South Africa, the English were the good whites, only after they lost power in the 48 election. Now, blacks have been drawn into this rubbish and spent lots and lots of ink with the received categories of actually interpreting South African history, with seriously devastating results on the problem of the transition and addressing the problem of historical justice. So the point is really that apartheid is not the basic problem. Okay, so if you study the ANC, which helped to lend a black credence to this sustenance of apartheid as the explanation for the historical antagonism, you see that at the last time that we did this, I cited from one of the petitions that the Congress wrote to King George V in 1914, in which they concede to the right of conquest and say, you have conquered us and the land belongs to you and you are our rightful sovereign. Okay? So the basic problem for the PAC, as Professor Modiri detailed it, is precisely that the basic problem is that war is what happened to us, and we lost that war. We are still losing that war. The war continues. The function of propaganda and discourse is to establish for us that the war is over and that the death and dying that is associated with us, with our lower life expectancies, with the poor kind of air that we breathe, the depreciating quality of water, and the exposure to wanton violence, it has nothing to do with the war. We are convinced, we are told that the nature of the miracle was the aversion of the war, that we are bloodthirsty youngsters who know nothing about what could have happened in this country if Mandela hadn't signed on the dotted line. We would have been in a war. But as I've made the point before, if one studies the statistics for violence in South Africa, one sees that all of them are fixed with them the condition in a place outside of war. Highest rate of murder in a place outside of war. Highest rate of rape in a place outside of war. Now the point is that we are not in a place outside of war. This is the mistake. You see, wherever you see peace in South Africa, it is a peace which is subsidized by a great force of arms. It is because there are private security here in this neighborhood. There is a patrol of 5 security companies that patrol each of the houses in this neighborhood every 15 minutes. Armed men who are willing to shoot. There are cameras all over this neighborhood. It's a panopticon. They have facial recognition and plate number recognition for whoever passes through those cameras. This is not science fiction. This is the neighborhood of MUCKLENEUK. This is the condition. This is what we call peace. It is the cost of going across the road without experiencing violence directly, is the preventative violence of the so-called private security. By any definitions, this is not what we call peace. So the point is that the miracle is a farce, the deaths which happen due to murder make up only a small fraction of the other violence which happens at a structural level and leads to shorter life expectancies for black people. But at the root of this is the misconception of the basic historical antagonism as apartheid, because what we have now is indeed properly describable as post-apartheid. What it is not, though, is post-conquest, because the title to territory, which was taken by force of arms, remains in the hands of the conqueror, and the sovereignty which rules over our conduct today is the will of the conqueror. You can see this, you can study it. We have put it down in writing, in some text, which I'll be happy to refer to. Now, the point is that unless this problem is resolved, we are going to continue dying until some senseless explosions take place. But the final point that I wish to make, I am timing myself. The final point which I wish to make is the point that we live in an enormously wealthy country, okay? We live in an enormously wealthy country, but the wealth of this country was the very thing that was taken by the force of arms. When we speak about title to territory as the first component and sovereignty over it as the second component, won by the right of conquest. When we say title to territory, we don't mean simply farming land or suburban dwelling land. The gold is found under the land. The diamonds, the platinum, the uranium is under the land. The Norwegian government, when it sells the oil which can be found in that country, divides the profits into its social welfare system to send everyone to school, to give them social housing. The cops in that country haven't carried guns for a very long time because they've resolved those social contradictions by socializing the basic wealth which their gods appear to have given them. We have even greater wealth. It is only a commitment to the profit motive and the refusal to address what could be resolved that keeps us in this situation. Thank you very much. Izwe lethu.
Yeah. Yena angazi ukuthi nidleni. Angazi ukuthi nidleni. But ikhona into enidleli. No, thanks so much for that, Kabadeli. You know, you were, as promised, you know, elegantly and radically anti-disciplinary. You threw us in so many directions, you know, so many directions. But of course, there was a lot of coherence in what you said. We could follow. We could follow. Beautifully presented. Thank you so much for that. Our last contribution is going to come from Professor Chaka, and after Professor Chaka, we will then hand over to our audience, which has been cognitively, you know, baptized in so many ways. Professor Chaka gets the opportunity to close this section of the panelists as we usher him to the podium.
Well, I suppose I have to keep time as well so that I stick to what the ones before me did. I was actually supposed to speak before so that you guys decide which direction this conversation go into. But as indicated, I am going to try and speak to this subject from a point of view of theology. And in preparation of my speech this evening, I was trying to decide which angle I'm going to come into this conversation. And so I figured perhaps I want to go back to some of the things that I think we don't hear that often. What we do hear often is that in theological circles, they will say to you that apartheid happened at the Lord's table. And so I figured, let me try and pursue that and see what comes from that. And I start by saying that apartheid as a phenomenon lacked an inherent theological underpinning until late in its development. The literature on the subject agrees that the white minority in South Africa felt threatened by the black majority and needed to take steps to protect their way of life. Apartheid is a system of racial segregation designed to keep the white minority in power. It is based on the idea that the races were not equal and that the white race was superior to others. We can assume that historical and social reasons favored the adoption of apartheid as a policy by the white Afrikaners, who only subsequently appealed to scripture and Calvinistic views to strengthen their case. Now, the Dutch Reformed Church formally appeared on South African soil in 1652. It convened its first synod in 1857. This synod decided that churches formed among the indigenous nations should celebrate the Eucharist separately from the so-called Europeans. This period following 1857 and lasting until 1927 is often referred to as the non-doctrinal era. During this period, the segregated churches were understood to be nothing more than a practical solution to accommodate the weakness of some who were uncomfortable celebrating the Lord's Supper with those whose social, cultural, and economic status they did not share. This arose from a deliberate move within Afrikaner reform circles to read the Bible for socio-economic purposes. What follows now is a bit of detail concerning this watershed moment in the history of Reformed church tradition in South Africa. In November 1857, the Synod of the Dutch Reformed Church in Southern Africa took a decision that would later prove of great historical significance. This decision reads in part as follows, and I quote, "Synod regards it as desirable and scriptural that our members out of heathendom should be accepted and incorporated within our existing congregations wherever this can happen. But where this measure could, as a result of the weakness of some, obstruct the advance of the cause of Christ amongst the heathen, then congregations consisting of heathen converts or those who may still so be formed shall enjoy their Christian privileges in a separate building or institution," close quote. What was the background to this infamous 1857 decision? Now, in 1855, a group of 45 white members approached the Church Council of the Congregation of Stockholmstrom in the Eastern Cape, where the minority members, where the white minority, members were in the minority, to request a separate communion service for them. The Church Council denied this request. The group made a second appeal, asking that they at least be served by white Church Council members after the rest of the congregation had celebrated the Lord's Supper. They cited, among others, Romans chapter 14, verse 1, which reads, "Welcome those who are weak in faith." They asked that the Church Council not be too harsh on their weaknesses. Although the Church Council allowed white Church Council members to be chosen, they did not agree to the separate celebration of the sacrament. Now, the Presbytery of Albany, under which this congregation resided, noted the request from a white minority group and suggested that because of the weakness and prejudices of these members, the Church Council should allow one or more tables to be set afterwards to serve them. Now, how do these events relate to the Synod of 1857? An elder from Malmesbury learned of the event in Stockholmstrom from a report in the official Dutch Reformed Church newspaper, Die Gereformeerde Kerkbode. This elder requested that the Presbytery of Albany's decision be read to the Synod of 1857 during a debate about a request from the congregation of Ceres in the Western Cape for a separate building for colored members. The debate revealed two positions. On the one hand, some felt that the racial prejudices must be challenged. On the other hand, some pleaded for caution, likely arguing that separate communion services were already common in many congregations. When the Synod reconvened the next day, the Reverend Andrew Murray Sr. made the proposal that I just quoted earlier to resolve this thorny issue. He proposed that while the Synod ideally wants to see converts from heathendom accepted and incorporated into existing congregations, because of the weakness of some, separate worship service could be allowed to advance the cause of Christ among the heathen. The matter was brought to a vote and accepted by a large majority. Case closed. So for this reason, I argue that an examination of the evolution of apartheid needs to consider not only the discomfort that some whites had with blacks, but also the socio-economic and political issues that precipitated the theological underpinnings of apartheid. To some extent, socio-economic, cultural, and political factors are evident in the Afrikaner people's search for identity.
There has been a long sense that the Afrikaner people identified with the Israelites. This is evident in the Great Trek, where the Old Testament played a key role in the idea of a chosen nation. The evolution of the idea of nationhood among the Afrikaner people in South Africa was strengthened after the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, and the subsequent challenges they face in their search for a place to call their own. It is perhaps fair to say that Afrikaner nationalist ideology developed historically in response to social change. The Anglo-Boer War is of particular importance because it illustrates the tensions among white people themselves and each group's ambition to hold a monopoly over South Africa's political realm. Now I come to this idea of Afrikaner nationhood. The Afrikaner Broederbond was founded in 1918. The question of the landless proletarians who congregated in cities was one this organization could not avoid. There was serious concern about possible competition for jobs between the black masses and the white proletariat. The Broederbond was meant to prevent its working class from responding as a class in all matters. It had to abort any class consciousness in its ranks. Nationalism was to become an important aspect which needed further promotion. The ideological legitimacy accorded to the political and organizational mobilization of Afrikaner-speaking workers was provided by some of the most noted Broederbond intellectuals, and I'm going to quote only 3 of them. The first is N. Didericks, second, J. Meyer, and third, G. Cronje. And this man worked zealously to present a theoretical framework of what apartheid was to look like and frequently address the white youth at Afrikaans universities. Obsessed with the idea of nationhood, each one presented a view of how the folk was to take shape. It has been suggested that among the 3, the most influential of all of them is N. Didericks. Didericks, who was a professor of political philosophy at Grey University College in the Free State, wrote what would become the most influential study on nationalism as a worldview in 1936. His most important work on nationhood was presented in his book titled Nationalisme as levensbeschouwing en sy verhouding tot internationalisme. Nationalism as a worldview and its relationship to internationalism. Of course, the likes of de Klerk are of the view that Didericks' treatise on nationalism as a worldview formed the basis of what was soon to be known as the concept of apartheid, or separate development. And this was the first sustained statement of theologized politics to come from an Afrikaner. For our interest, it has to be noted that although Didericks had been trained at various European universities and was obviously influenced by German philosophies, his work mentioned above formed the core of the Afrikaner's new politics, which aligned not to Calvinism as contained in the institutes, but to its Puritan mutations, and later New Calvinist accretions. Didericks' idea of nationhood was that a nation both is and at the same time is coming into being. Based on this understanding, Didericks concluded that the notion of universal humanity was an impossibility. Self-evidently, he rejected equality and suggested that the only equality that could be accepted was the equality of opportunity for each to bring that which was within him to full expression. And this could only be achieved when the individual perceived himself as a member of the nation. Then Moody surmises that the work was of a latter new Fichten variety. What is most problematic was, of course, Didericks' usage of the concept nation. His idolization of this concept had elicited strong responses from some Capeans, especially J. Du Plessis. Moody again reminds us of an excerpt of an exchange that happened between Didericks and Du Plessis, which also appeared in the Volksblad in April of 1936. In that excerpt, Du Plessis admitted that although Didericks rightly placed God above nation, he had gone too far with the manner in which he did this, because above me as an individual is not the nation, but God and God alone, close quote. Now, another important work, of course, comes from the pen of Meyer, and he titled it The Afrikaner. It was written and published in 1941 by a man who had once been the head of the Broederbond as a summary of the Afrikaner nation's central calling. The work of G. Cronje is relatively closely related to that of Diederichs and perhaps to some extent to that of Meyer. It was also a significant piece of work for the system that was to put in place later. For all intents and purposes, it contained everything that was to be of consequence for a later unraveling of apartheid ideology. And now he called his book A Taster vir die Nageslag, a home for posterity. It is inevitable that the question of superiority manifested in their perception of white culture and civilization also contributed to the way they interpreted reality. Cronje is clearly not living the ideal that the Afrikaner will prosper to the will of God, but continues to argue that this will become feasible because of their knowledge that they have, which justify the means that they are superior. All these statements were viewed not only from socio-economic and political perspectives, but also contained an intrinsic divine element that ostensibly enlightened the views of these advocates. Cronje wrote another book later, and this time with two prominent theologians. One, W. Nicol, who was once a moderator of the DRC, and the other, E.P. Groenewald. And Nicol was the one who argued that whites could be good Christians and at the same time watch over the survival of their race with holy gravity. Groenewald declared that he wished the separation to be complete. He maintained that the fact that God had given the various nations their separate existences implied that they should remain separate. Israel itself was the proof of how God had willed national preparedness, national separateness. Apart from all of these devious concoctions, some black theologians believe that it was even more important to look at the issue of land and how the seizure of land acted as an impulse to cripple the black race in South Africa. Puti Tlhagale, for instance, traces the white obsession for monopoly over black land and labor to the infamous 1913 Natives Land Act, which sought to lay down permanent lines of territorial segregation between blacks and whites. In his opinion, this was one of the factors, coupled with the growing demand for labor in the mining, industrial, and agricultural sectors, that accelerated the process of proletarialization. In essence, one can detect some pseudo-concern in most of the liberties which were afforded to the black population of South Africa. This pseudo-concern remains evident in Hendrik Verwoerd's speeches. When he was still Minister of Education, Verwoerd remarked that education must train and teach in accordance with their opportunities in life, according to the sphere in which they live. Education should have its roots entirely in the native areas and in the native environment and native community in all aspects. There is no place for him in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor, close quote. It can further be argued that this pseudo-concern had its roots in the paternalistic reality evident among missionaries of the time in Africa. At one of the later synods, where the DRC discussed separate development, it was admitted that the traditional Afrikaner fear of equality of treatment between blacks and whites had its origin in his antipathy to the idea of racial fusion. Kinghorn refers to a Broederbond publication on racial studies, which is fundamental to understanding the deliberate fear instilled in the moral fiber of the general Afrikaner populace. Suffice it to say that this view still has implications for the way black and white, as well as black and colored, perceive each other today. It was this stereotype which would later substantiate the DRC's stance concerning mixed marriages. Consequently, it would be easy for the church to underpin government legislation which prohibited these types of marriages. This purportedly superiority forced many blacks to accept their status as being inferior to whites. To compound the chaotic political situation of theology in South Africa, Biblical hermeneutics were designed with the specific purpose of justifying the then South African politics. Biblical texts, read selectively and in a fundamentalist way, acted as intermediaries to justify apartheid. A great deal of consideration was given to Old Testament texts. However, some New Testament passages that emphasized the distinctions between nations were also consulted. The debate was expanded from a history of creation to new creation. The unity of Christ was spiritual and not a challenge to the elemental truth of racial discrimination, because it was believed that recreation was based on creation. The church, as a sign of the kingdom, was also marked by the divisions in its identity and the calling to maintain the orders among others. The conclusion was that not only was the Christian society called upon to honor racial segregation, but the church, as an instrument of God's design, had to especially obey apartheid and had therefore to oppose the occurrence of racial mixed congregations fiercely. The many theologians found an ally in the theology of the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper. The result was that Kuyper's new Calvinism provided the impetus for a theologized politics in South Africa. I want to end by saying, I'm saying all of these long things that I've just said to just make the point that we cannot, in all fairness, speak of a so-called church struggle against apartheid. I say this because if you look at how decisions were made, these were always synods who made these decisions. Yes, you had a number of individuals struggling against apartheid, but not synods who wrote declarations calling apartheid out for what it really was. And it's also on that basis that when we consider a notion that has become quite known within the confessional circles called the Latin word adiaphora, which simply means a neutral matter, you'll understand that apartheid was perceived as a neutral matter. And neutral in the sense that it does not impinge on the essence of the gospel. And that's why people were forgiven for treating their workers, black workers, as the way that they did, because it was not seen as a matter that impinged the gospel at the time. And so when we speak of the whole idea of making confessions as it is the tradition in the Reformed church tradition at least, you'll understand that a confession is brought about by synods and not by individuals. And on that basis, therefore, I think we are wrong when we want to speak about a church struggle against apartheid, as many has done, and of course we know that the Grucci has pushed that to the greatest extent, because it was individuals and not synods who spoke out and fought against apartheid. I want to park on that note, Mr. Moderator.
I thought you were also going to deal with the part of why was the chairperson of the Truth Commission from your tradition, you know, whether it had to do with those types of things. But thank you so much. That concludes the presentations from our very esteemed and very thought-provoking panelists. Can we just express our love to our panelists, you know? So for the work that goes into it. So I'm just not doing the formality, you know, which comes as part of the KRAs of a program director. But I also have one of the things that I value black people who take themselves and their audiences seriously, you know. So I make this point because there are also these things where mediocrity is made synonymous with being black. It's even made a radical thing, you know, to be mediocre, not to be thorough, and not to go to the root of things, and not to prepare properly, and not to be on time, you know. And I like the manner in which our presenters today showed here that this is actually what it means to be a black person, you know, to know your stuff, to prepare very well, and to also just do your things with so much finesse and elegance, because it is also important for us to set a very proper example for younger black people to see how things should be done in the manner that you've done that. So you really warmed the heart of this fellow called the program director. You know. Yeah, because there is just this recycling of blackness as mediocrity, you know, in the way other people do things, that if it's done by black people, it has to be clumsy, it has to be all of those things. So I just like the manner in which you nicely and elegantly dealt with it. Now, before we go into, because we need to allow our audience to digest, you know, you guys prepared very thoroughly, you know. Now, as part of helping them digest, and I've been planning to say this, Prof. Mudiri, the whole evening, you know, I was rehearsing this in my head. We are going to have what is usually referred to as a cultural item, right? That is going to be rendered by our brother who goes by the name Torsten Clear Redbeka. Torsten Clear Redka, yeah. He says I did it well, yeah. Can we usher him to the podium and then we will go into that session?
Good evening, everybody. I hope you are well and warm. And hi, Katika. My name is Torsten Clear Redbeka, and the reason why I call myself Clear on stage is because hint, hint, nudge, nudge. In the most profound words by the most acknowledged comedian in America known as Dave Chappelle, who said there is a phenomenon that is plaguing us as humans in general by saying that there is a phenomenon called by standing too close to an elephant. If you're standing too close to an elephant, you're only gonna see its skin. But if you stand back, you can see the whole elephant holistically. So just to give a beautiful twist to the conversation that we've had this evening, is that I'm going to render a poem. I wanted to render a poem called No Privileges here, but it is as heavy as the discussion that took place. But let me just give it a nice twist by giving you a poem about, this poem will explain to each and every one of you why I'm such a yellow bone. Cool. The poem is titled Against All Odds. The house that I grew up in was built by two different worlds. Two worlds on two opposite sides of the earth. My father, from the west side of the Berlin Wall, the last of two children with an age gap of 10 years, with a driven passion to mend mechanical horses, tilting and toiling in oil, to plant a living and to harvest joy. My mother, a rough diamond from the landmines of Cullinan, firstborn of 7 children and a second mother to them all, with skills to turn kitchens into soulful feasts and can make your heart feel at home when you are away from it. In 1983, fate brought these two worlds to one place, and it seemed like God had a hand in it, and they were a gift to each other. To get acquainted with each other's feelings, eyes were set on each other like the sun, and they were each other's beautiful horizon. Their hearts became their ships, guided by the same northern star, setting sail to reach love's shore, looking forward to a lifetime adventure. His colleague was his wingman, aiding him to complete his mission. He was so focused on her that everything in reality became a blur. She tiptoed around him, showing off a timid side, blushing with dazzling cheeks with feelings reflecting through her eyes. But this relationship took place in an era when hatred was loved, segregation was practiced on the basis of contrast and skins, and they would walk that extra mile with their broken, tested backs to bend and break the laws of men for them to taste the peace of heaven. But still, with faith, they marched on, moving about to keep the love alive, ducking and diving to keep away from the public naked eye. And she would play the maid, and he would be the boss. This became a suitable lunch date in a city apartment. The owners would rat about this illegal love affair to the po-po for them to be caught red-handed. This news traveled fast, which caused a huge domino effect. His cousin disowned him as his tools got packed when he was sacked. court. And he would disguise himself in a balaclava as she waited for him to arrive in the townships without being noticed. In the dusty streets of Shoshanguve, they met in their secret means and ways. My grandparents struggled to accept this as it gave them sleepless nights. The neighbors would snitch on them, and they would call the army with ease. It became an immediate war zone as my father's head was kissed by guns, and my mother would cry on the shoulders of heaven, praying in tears, asking death not to steal his soul. At that very same time, they were nursing their firstborn, a new seed. People would call their offspring with vile names such as fleas, and they were labeled as a walking sin, a blasphemy to the nation, condemned by lurking eyes and stoned by distant words. But still, they were happy and comfortable in each other's skin, fighting the negative with smiles, walking hand in hand years later. In a black and white country that became a rainbow nation, they displayed their love, made by the I do's they said. They painted the streets of Haranguwa red, with love blossoming in their names, with a blue sky paving a way for brighter days. My father, the Prince Charming of the day, wearing a black and white tuxedo, wearing white gloves with confidence, with a full-blown beard. My mother, the queen of the day, glowing and flowing in a white wedding dress, holding a bouquet of white flowers with a smile as white as her shoes. The marriage hit the front page news, sparked a change in people's hearts, planting hope and light, believing that love can conquer any kind of war. After 30 years of being married, love still breathes with them, sticking together like paper and glue. They managed to see it through the roller coaster ride called life, and against all odds, freedom cemented their love.
Okay, for him, you have to do it slightly differently, you know, so, yeah. No, thank you so much, my brother. He's got an interesting story that he shared with me, but I don't, you know, just about who he is and his background. If we have time, I will share that. A very interesting story that he shared with me. Thank you so much for what you did for us, my brother. May I request our esteemed panelists to just fill those chairs on stage. We are now going to give an opportunity to the audience to interact with what you've presented. Yeah, you are serious academics. You still take your notepad. Yeah, you don't. You still take your notepads. Thank you so much. So, in the time that we have allocated, right, which is the time that we allocated to you, our esteemed audience, right, without whom this gathering would not have been possible. This is now your opportunity to ask questions, make comments from the presentations that you've got. They're drinking water proactively. And to make sure that we get as many people as possible asking questions, just be considerate in the length that you take, you know. We are not writing another constitution, so there's not necessary to be long on the preamble and, you know, yeah, so if we can try our best to be brief, you know, but we still want to get to hear what you're saying. So are we going to use the mics? There are mics here. So okay, yeah. All right. All right. So if there are hands, people who just wish to express their views, please by show of hands, and can the mics find you? Yes, ma'am. You are going to help me, Alap, yeah, closer. If you don't mind, you can introduce yourself. It's not compulsory.
Thank
Thank you. Rodney, you know, I did not even want to ask any question, but thank you for reminding us, the first speaker, about how the black body was constructed. And I think Alexander Bouchard, in his book, The Anatomy of Power, the European construction of the black body, and how medicine in South Africa came to being, you know, that we must not see medicine separately from us as black people. But I want to ask a question to all of you, and you are welcome to decide, and I think the jurisprudence one will be the right person to answer, perhaps. I'm struggling with this. We get into, we still today have what we call Afrikaner schools, where Afrikaans is a medium of instruction. And you go to the townships, coming from a township myself, I have to go through a process. You're taught in English, but at home I speak Setswana. My first language, you've got 3 languages at school, you've got Setswana, English, and Afrikaans. And you go to the English schools, you've got English and Afrikaans, or you've got Afrikaans and English as the medium of instructions. And so, how in this time, what you call the post-apartheid, or the continuation of it, how do we deal with this segregationalist idea that still continues? I mean, the ANC government agreed that the schools in Centurion, for example, majority of them remain Afrikaner schools. And as a result of it, if you, as a black person living in those places, opportunities of a child getting into a school area. But my question is about the medium of instruction.
Sure.
And that is my question, the medium of instruction.
All right, thank you. The next question or comment?
No, thank you. My name is Mutlatsi Khosi. Dr. Masinga, first of all, thank you to all the speakers. That was truly amazing. My mind has just been absolutely blown out the water. Dr. Masinga, I'm just wondering with how we were talking about the use of black bodies, I'm also thinking in terms of how, like, the birth of gynecology, how gynecology, it started with a doctor practicing on slaves who couldn't consent and there was no anesthesia. And then when you look at that continuing today with obstetric violence, the fact that black women are dying on the birthing table, not just in South Africa, but also in Europe, also in America. Like, what does this mean what does this mean for medicine to you? Because it seems that medicine has always been about using the black body, and it cannot survive if not for having the black body to be there, not consenting to be used. Where do you see this going? Can medicine move forward? Or is a radical change even possible? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next question or comment?
Thank you very, very much for the presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed each and every one of them. I will perhaps start off with Prof. Chaka. I think we've had a number of engagements on some of the matter. So the church always comes across institutionally as violent. And I am kind of interested in whether you think the church as an institution can kind of contribute to any positive thing in our society, because wherever it is, it's not just the reformed thing, it always exists as institutional violence. And of course, considering as well consider it also in light of Ramos's sentiments as well, with regards to the church on an epistemic sense. So I'm kind of interested in what you would do with that. And then of course to Prof. Mudiri, do you think constitutional democracy is a thing? Is it workable, considering the challenges that you have kind of raised? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your questions. The next audience member. Do we have? We don't have for now. All right, let's get responses You can decide amongst yourself, yeah. Okay, let's just see if we can get a mic that's miking.
I did switch it on, but that time it refused to work with me. I think thank you, Ayanda, for the question, because I think that's quite an important question. And sometimes people think it's a wrong question. When it comes to church, you're not supposed to think like that. Because church is anything but what you are saying. Yet when you look at the kinds of things that it does and the casualties that it has created and continue to create, you realize that the church is also quite a violent institution. But I think our biggest problem is the templates still. We cannot say other templates must be dismantled or must be gotten rid with. Then we retain certain ones because we are quite uncomfortable thinking that they should be dismantled. Let me just make this example quickly. So the idea in theology that the church is the body of Christ. I was one time, put into a corner when a person made the argument that because there are people who live with the disease, with HIV and AIDS, then we should be changing that to say the body of Christ has got HIV and AIDS. Now, the response that came from the audience, because you see, we have this idea of what the body of Christ is supposed to be. And when you think of that, you don't connect that to the very people who make up that body. So you are selective in saying, yes, I can live with the idea that this is the body of Christ only if it is not associated with people living with HIV and AIDS, for instance. That's what we do, because we have got concepts and we cannot imagine these concepts being violent, for instance, like the church has. And I made the point deliberately that the decisions for apartheid came from the church as an institution. Of course, it is made up of individuals, but the decision is a church decision. It is not individuals' decisions. So, to respond to your question, the church is very violent, even as we speak today.
Thank you. These were two questions. Let me start with the one about Afrikaans. I think there are many debates here, including a strong body of scholarship coming from the Western Cape and other parts about, let's call it the black origins of Afrikaans as a language. During the fees must fall configuration at the University of Pretoria, this question of Afrikaans became an issue. And I must admit that I thought it was a massive failure of political imagination for a large number of people at the University of Pretoria to consider the replacement of Afrikaans with English as decolonization. I thought this is truly bizarre. And that the exchange of masters is no freedom or decolonization at all. The question that you're asking is just another version of the question of why do we remain unfree? Why do we not have economic, cultural, social power to be able to build our own institutional, our own educational institutions, among other things? And here I'm reminded of the debates, especially in the US, among the black radicals there, pertaining to exclusion from restaurants. You know, the famous line from the people in Alabama that upon being allowed to eat in white restaurants, they discovered how lousy the food was. Now, it seems to me this to be the same. The question is important because it asks, why is it that, of course, so much concentrated social and political power lies with the Afrikaner community, if you want to call it that, and also why it is that so many blacks fetishize this desire for a black AfriForum. These are all, I think, unsovereign mentalities. It's desires to belong to rather than for these institutions to belong to us. So I suppose, the Afrikaners are doing what they're supposed to do. We're supposed to do what we're supposed to do. And this is the question, why can't we do it? Why can't we build our own institutions? Because you will send these black children to institutions that despise them, tended to teachers who don't care for them. So my protest against this is not that I would like my child to go to Menlo Park or wherever else. It's really to ask about what is the social and economic structure that permits the continuation of these kinds of things, and why is the present government permitting this? As far as the legalities, we can go into it in a complicated way, but it has to do with the negotiations in the early 90s around the right to culture and the rights of freedom of association, which created this kind of thing. This is in a sense connected to the question on constitutional democracy. Do I think it's a thing? Yes, I think it's a thing. Not a good thing, though. I think that our work has tried to show that constitutional democracy has been part of the re-articulation of relations of conquest, that it is implicated in the perpetuation of particular kinds of historical inequalities and exclusions, and that we need to imagine a different kind of social and political order. The harder question for all of us, not just for me, is what kinds of institution building and theory building needs to be done to think about these models. My basic sense is that the political model is not going to be the primary vehicle for this, and that we do need to think by way of an interdisciplinary research project about what these questions look like psychologically, economically, institutionally, and otherwise. But I have no doubt that the celebration of constitutional democracy or liberal democracy, as far as the question of black freedom is concerned, is really a dead end.
I'd like to respond to the question regarding the Department of Gynecology and Obstetric Violence. So, this question brought up a lot for me because I did my preceptorship at the hospital where I was born, which is Mamelodi Hospital. It used to be called Mamelodi Day Hospital, or DAG, because you would only stay for a day. They wouldn't keep you for, even if you were giving birth, then you have your baby, you go home. If there are complications, then you'll be moved to a different facility. But doing my preceptorship at the same hospital where I was born gave me so much context about the reality that my mother was living at the time, and it also gave me so much context about the way or the environment in which we are conducting medicine. So in the obstetrics ward, the obstetrics and gynecology section of Mamelodi Hospital, there were CTG machines, right? So your CTG is your cardiotocograph. That is what measures the heart rate of the baby in utero, right? So the CTG machines were sourced in China, and all of the CTGs in the hospital were broken. And in order to get them fixed, someone either had to come from China to fix them, or they had to be taken to China to get fixed. And the manager of the hospital, who I admire so much, Dr. Spencer Nkosi, he basically took me under his wing during my preceptorship, and he explained to me the difficulties under which they were working, right? And so, as a person who has worked on the ground in medical facilities in South Africa, I can tell you that everyone is doing their absolute best in a situation where we don't even have the basics like suture kits for suturing a woman after she has given birth and is bleeding and needs stitches. We don't have suture kits. And so what we are using are the normal kits that you would use to, for example, on a Friday night, someone comes in, they've been hit on the head, and now you have to suture them. That same suture kit that you would use there is now what you're using on this pregnant woman, because that's all that we have. And so I am defending, and I know it's such a terrible thing to say, but I am defending my colleagues in the medical field and saying that everyone is doing their absolute best in a system that is not easy to work in, because the money that was supposed to go to us having suture kits has gone elsewhere. Someone has a new car or a new house, but we don't have suture kits. So it is very, very difficult to answer that question regarding how we go forward. And I'm not denying the reality of obstetric violence. I know, I have seen it firsthand. I remember there was an occasion where one of the professors from the university was coming to the ward, and now everyone was just scrambling. And things were being done differently that day, because you can't be seen hitting the thighs of a patient on a day where the professor is there. But it's just, those are the things that happen when women are giving birth, right? Because now, hey, all of those things, right? And they're not explaining to patients what they're trying to say, because what they're saying there is that if the woman doesn't push, then the baby is going to suffer from hypoxia, right? Because there's a very limited time that the baby can be now coming down the canal, right? The birth canal. And now the language that is used by nurses is very violent and very harmful. And so the message gets lost because they're not able to explain to the patient hypoxia, because how are you going to explain that to someone who's not in the field? And I was speaking to Prof. Chaka earlier about this, that we have this language that we use in the field that doesn't translate in the streets. People don't understand what we're talking about. And so there's a disconnect. And for me, personally, one of my favorite things about medical training was that we could work with community healthcare workers. And they were the in-between between us and the community. And they could translate our message to the community. And so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. But what I can say is that as someone who has worked in the field, the nurses are doing their best. They're working shifts that aren't even theirs. Everyone is doing their absolute best in a system where, I mean, we saw what happened with COVID. We saw what happened to the money that was supposed to go to protective equipment. So I feel as if the system is very overstretched and everyone is doing what they can. And unfortunately, it doesn't look good. Because it isn't good. It's rotten, but we are doing our best.
Okay, sure, thanks. Kabateli.
Oh, no, I don't have a question.
Okay. No, it's fine. Okay. No, that's fine. So let's see if we can take another round after this round. No. I heard you the first time. I heard you. Don't worry. They also heard you. So can we just note a couple of new ends, and then your question will be answered once we deal with this round. They've heard you, my brother. Don't worry. So can we get a couple of new ends?
Well, thank you very much. I think we were treated to a feast of metaphors in terms of how you do your Afrocentric, speeches, in a way. Prof. Chaka feasting at the table of exclusion, where you're not wanted. Prof. Mudiri worshipping at the altar of constitutional democracy. and Dr. Not Reseng, Masing. This membering of black bodies, and Prof. Dala, they staged and sponsored fake peace in our spaces. And I was wondering, well, these kind of conversations, why are we not taking it to the center? Because even if you check tonight, how many are we? And the more this conversation is hidden at some corners or at the backstage, the more the society remain untransformed. And we need to start seeing some epistemic resistance in our institutions in a much bigger way. Where is the voice of, like, your fees must fall? What is happening with the black academics in our institutions? We are too quiet and too busy for nothing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Thank you. I'm going to take advantage of the mic's proximity and ask two quick questions, particularly to Professor Dlala. Many of you have mentioned white supremacy, and my question is what we have come to know as white supremacy not a mischaracterization of inferiority-induced fear of extinction on the part of the white person? And does that not place an obligation, particularly on academics, to articulate what we have come to know as white supremacy in its correct term as white inferiority, presenting itself as supremacy? And my last question to Professor Chaka is the characterization of South Africa as a Christian country. Is that not a measure of how pervasive colonial violence still is in this country? Thank you.
There's the last two there at the back. There, it's three here.
Dumelang bagolo, leina ke Mutsidisi, and my question is directed at Dr. Nkateko. I've always been interested in the concept of the black body as highly contested terrain, right? So you have proven today beyond reasonable doubt that even in death, the black body remains highly contested terrain. So my question to you then is, at what point does the black body get a break? What, in your opinion, would that kind of break look like in your field of expertise? And this is also premised on how the Germans held onto the Herero skulls despite a lot of galvanizing, despite a lot of petitioning, despite a lot of pleading. So at what point do we stop being what the world sees us as? At what point do we basically stop being highly contested terrain and just be?
Okay, thanks.
Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to the program director. I'll keep it brief. It's really one question, but it sounds like two questions. And I'm being a little bit mischievous here in that I kind of want to take Prof. Chaka's presentation and throw it into some of the provocations from Prof. Mudiri and Dr. Dladla, and particularly on the apartheid colonialism thing. And I want to just ask, doesn't the reformed framework tell only half the story? In the sense that the Cape liberal tradition is also itself as a tradition built on the back of the missionary phenomena and tradition, a Christian and a theological framework which founds liberalism in South Africa, not so much apartheid. So I have, and enfolded within that question is my real question, which is, I wonder if we shouldn't perhaps broach as to whether anti-blackness as such, whether it is in the form of the Cape liberal tradition, apartheid, whether it's a proto-apartheid, actual apartheid, post-hyper-apartheid, or even their coalition in the Union of South Africa and the Republic of South Africa are not, if these are not theology, whose key and inaugural theological gesture is the disavowal of the register of the theological as the secular. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. That's our last question.
You see, the problem of us sitting together and having too many conversations, we construct questions, you know, that are so closely related. So there's an assertion that Carl Schmitt makes about you know, the relationship between theology and the state, or theory of the state. He says that all significant concepts around theory of state are simply secularized theological concepts, and I think that much has been demonstrated by the interdisciplinary endeavor that took place in the round table today. Now, I think what I'm curious to hear, particularly from the two advocates of post-conquest polity, what is the, have you given to the religious logical underpinnings of the polity that you're thinking of, to translate it into Setswana? Ke sedimo se feng se leng gore se tlo tshegetsa puso e leng gore la e batla, right? To Dr. Masinga, towards the end of is it in the wake or in the, yes, she talks about Krishna Shah describes anti-blackness as total climate, right? Intimating how all pervasive anti-blackness is. And I'm wondering, have you given any thought to any practices that embody the wake work that she talks about in the course of the book, particularly within your field of practice? Thank you very much.
All right. Is that the last one? Okay, yes. The difficulty is the preambles, you see. Yeah, because they eat into the time of the other comrades. You know, can we take this last one?
Yep. To be summoned, being summoned. But it's okay, moderator. I'll cut it short. But just to indicate that I think the inputs through the presentations has really been very thought-provoking. Has been, for me, from the onset, a bit demoralizing, especially from the singer, particularly the issue surrounding the body of the black person. But I guess one must move on from there. But to support this input made here by the Deputy Dean, I think we're extremely, in most cases, comfortable with our environment. It's about really time that you take these things out of the space. I'm sure it will even generate more interest. But importantly is conscientization of the black masses.
Okay.
Let me just check quickly something with the last speaker. In the context of South Africa, but particularly black theology, which has originated as a response to apartheid and racism, often being too political. Of course, we hear now the issue around violence within the church. That's issue for another. Yet from, not necessarily from your submission, but what one gathers is that apartheid was given biblical and theological sanction by the very ones who criticize black theology. Can you assist me maybe just to understand what is the difference? And is that criticism really justified in the context of, thank you.
Okay, if I would kindly invite you to join me in congratulating by way of round of applause. Our last contributor graduated earlier today. So I was patient with him because today is his day, you see. Yeah. So this is our last round, and you can also then use the opportunity to make your final statements if you so wish. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
So my apologies. There's a question that we did not answer in the first round, right? We must please make sure we address it.
As we know, in the recorded history of philosophy, an endless set of questions have been asked by man over time and continue to be asked anew. So we can't possibly hope to answer every question and prevent the asking of further questions. Let me say to the asker that the asking will continue. All right. The first thing that I should like to say is in response to our sister's description of the harrowing situation in public healthcare. And it's to invite perhaps counterintuitively that we consider this problem to be a political and not simply a moral problem. And it's a political economic problem, which is the problem of capitalism. For those that studied the headlines around the world would have been startled to see that the problems of the PPE, that the problem of the, please tell them what it is again.
PPE is personal protective equipment.
Right, so the scandals with using the public fiscus for the benefiting of politically connected in economic strata of businessmen, it went all around the Western world where people tried to reconcile democracy and capitalism. The British, there were billions, hundreds of billions in rand terms stolen from the British people, with shortages showing up. And for those who study the deterioration of public infrastructure in the capitalist countries, one will see that the trains of the United States have not been refurbished and have been collapsing and backwards since the last time central planning played any role in the 1950s and 60s when Amtrak was built. That water is poisoned. In the supposed richest country on earth, the state fails to provide water to its people. So what you see here, you know, we know the figure of the African politician as an especially corrupt fellow who is easily enticed to buy many Ferraris. And of course, our brothers have been very silly. Even for those who steal, they still need some imagination. I mean, how many Ferraris can you really want to drive? But the point is really that it's a structural phenomenon which has to do with the fact that the profit motive is allowed to commit this rapacious violence on the public good, and the right to life is subjected here to the ability for profit to be made at the expense of either sustaining that life or taking it away. And this is a problem which is structural, and it finds itself presiding over the public healthcare system in South Africa by no small part originating in the so-called negotiated settlement, which took place. So far from us discussing different things, there's a continuity between our call for the abolition of the Constitution and the abolition of the subjection of the right to life to the ability of corporations to make profits. Sometimes the corporations are represented by very foolish people who use what they steal to buy some Ferraris, but even the clever amongst the thieves usually reinvest in the stealing of elsewhere at a higher intensity. So we need to understand the material question which underlies this phenomenon and not focus on the Ferrari itself, but the profit motive, because of course Ferrari is also not made in South Africa. The money returns to their masters in each of these cases, and this is something we really need to pay regard to. It's not really just a moral phenomenon of good and bad behaviors of individual people, but a structural economic phenomenon which must be addressed by fundamental revolutionary means. Okay. Number two, there's a very interesting formulation which I can see Francis Cress, in the formulation that in fact we ought to really consider that rather than white supremacy, what we have is an inferiority induced. So the point, I suppose, is a distinction between ises and oughts, and the point is what white supremacy is. The reason for which it exists is something which we can debate, what motivates it. But the point which we're making is that through the violence of war, which the white man has successfully used, an order of hierarchization of human populations has been established, and each rung of the hierarchy corresponds to life chances. It is a predictor for income level, for life expectancy, for quality of life. This is what we describe as white supremacy, the result, the effect. The cause, why it is, whether it's psychological motivations, economic, there are discussions and debates between different theoreticians about this. And I won't try to, in our work we cover what we think the cause is, but there are many contentions about this. But our reference to white supremacy is really in describing the material result of the war which is being waged upon us. And that whether or not we are inferior or superior is not really the problem here. The point is that our lives are inferiorized. We fail in school tests. We die at higher rates. We are killed by preventable diseases. This is the fact. This is the fact of what living white supremacy actually looks like, okay? Yeah, so this is the preoccupation. But the question about the causes theoretically is one which I would love. It's amongst those questions which I say must continue to be posed. Then there is one last one. I can't take all these ones. I'll leave some to my learned colleagues. The question of the political theology. It was a very, it was a question with meanders. Lots of meanders, And so I will answer it in a poetic fashion, following the poet. I think you are a reader of Ramos. He does make a very interesting point about the meaning of unkulunkulu and its resistance to the subjection of the mechanism of what you call Theos Logos. That is my answer to you.
Okay, thanks you. Siyabonga Mkabateli.
So when does the black person get to rest? I have been mulling it over in my head, and I was thinking of someone who said that black people never get to rest because even after they die, then they have to now clock in as ancestors. So you have another job that's starting immediately when you pass away, and then now they're asking you for all sorts of things, and they're going to the river every week, and now you have to make sure they get what they need. And it really spoke to the fact that there's no visualization of what it looks like for a black person to rest. Even in the afterlife, it's another job. And I think it also depends on what your definition of rest is. What does it mean to you to rest? And thinking of all of the freedom fighters of previous years and how there isn't a single one of them who didn't have a speech that said, "I will not rest until," because there was something that was being worked towards. So I think we each have our own "I will not rest until." And that's why we sit and have these conversations, because there are certain things that we envision, not only for ourselves, but for those who come after us. And I think for me, my "I will not rest until" has always been about being safe in this country. Because when I think about the fact that it's late at night, there are so many things that I have to think about. The steps that stand between where I am now and me being safely at home, right? And in a country like ours, it's not a guarantee that you're going to make it for so many different reasons. And I think of I can't rest because of that. And I cannot rest until it is a reality where I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm going to make it home safely. And I'm thinking about a time when I was in Belgium at the Brussels Poetry Festival, and it was a group of us from South Africa who went there. And we walked home one day at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I remember the other poet, because we were there to perform. So the other poet then said to me, "Wouldn't it be so nice to be able to do this back home? Like to just be able to walk at 2 a.m. and not have to worry about your safety." So I wish I had a positive answer to that question about when we will rest. But I think that what I would like to offer is that rest looks different for each of us, and we're all working towards something in the meantime. And so I then throw a question back at you and ask you, what is your "I will not rest until"?
Okay, thank you, sis.
And regarding the second question about how we can practice wake work. So that one is very challenging, but it makes me think of the Witchcraft Suppression Act and the fact that now I've heard the conversation being had about why are there so many traditional healers popping up and all of that. I think we've gotten to a point where a lot of people, yes, that act was abolished, but I think that it's only recently that a lot of people are coming back to an understanding of their roots and where they're coming from. And for me, when we were doing pharmacology in med school, we were taught that the pharmacological industry manipulated traditional healers. They asked them where their herbs were grown. They sourced those herbs without not in ways that were sustainable, not to say, here's now what you can grow in the meantime. They took everything. They took everything. And a lot of the medicine that now you're being given in the hospital is rooted in the knowledge that was taken from those traditional healers. And so you'll go to your doctor and they'll tell you, oh, don't mix this with traditional herbs. It's one industry vilifying another. And so, but also vilifying the industry that it stole from. So it's very, very difficult. I think how we practice our wake work is that we stay true to our traditions and we hold on to our traditions and we remember our traditions. Thank you. Okay. And I have to leave, everybody. I'm so sorry, but you can contact me. My website is nkatekomasinga.com. You can just drop a message in the contact form and then we can continue this conversation. Yes.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Nkata. Okay. As we excuse you, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I thought Jewel is going to respond to some of the questions on my behalf. But anyway, let me try and see whether I can lump them together. Shweme has asked a question, with regards to this, whether South Africa is a Christian country and maybe the implications for that. Drew has also asked a question with regards to black theology, which was brought into existence to rebuff, white theology in South Africa. And our guys there, as usual, has also asked the question of the reform framework, whether it tells the whole story, really. So I'm trying to see whether I'll do justice by just responding. And of course, I'm not a provider of answers, really. I try, so you'll decide whether or not this is something you can live with. But I think my biggest problem is the fact that we are living with contradictions. Contradictions in the sense that it is quite easy for people to want to say, as Diederik has done, that there is no such a thing as a universal humanity. But people want to speak about a universal Christianity, for instance. And so the next point for me is that what we have as Christianity in this country is merely something that has not allowed for any integration, but just an assimilation. Assimilation into something that also says to us that it is bigger than culture. For instance, for you to be a Christian means that you have graduated from your culture, which is considered inferior and backward, for instance. Now, my biggest problem is not so much what I am saying, but I find that my biggest challenge comes from black folk themselves when I say some of these issues. I mean, if you speak about integration, and yet we are struggling in black communities with the whole idea of where do we locate Badimu, or that you would reduce African culture to only one thing, that is Badimu, as if nothing else exists. And these are the challenges that unfortunately don't come from white folk these days, but they come from black folk who say, what do you want to do to our Christianity now? That point is, we've got this pure, nice thing. You want to bring in your own things. You're messing up this thing of ours. So, and this is the conversation that I think we as black folk ought to have among ourselves. That we don't get, again, white folk are quite happy to go to bed letting us fight this thing out among ourselves. Because we have an idea of how Christianity should look like, which is that thing that is white and nothing like us. And that is why we're still quite comfortable, I say, to have and to buy dolls that don't look like us to our kids. I told my congregation the other day that it's quite interesting to know that children today still prefer white dolls over black dolls with big noses. Anyway, so I'm simply saying, Shweme and Mudi say that it is funny that white theology would criticize us for not doing pure and proper theology when we use Marxist analytical tools in looking at our own situation. Yet they were the first ones who insisted in using selective biblical texts
to justify why they are superior and why black people should be treated as inferior. The contradictions that we live with.
Okay, our last panelist.
I was trying to slip off the stage, in part because I don't want to, enter the theology question, because I'll also name a few other whites. Karl Marx, of course, deals with this problem. Freud is where I come from, the debates between Freud and his readers in A Future of Illusion. Suffice simply to say that, and Hobbes, of course, the state replaces God, and so on and so forth. I think of many things. The first thing that I want to think of is the fact that the principal theoreticians of the Azanian traditions were Christians, and that their Christianity was not incidental but fundamental to their project. And of course that one of the primary black radicals, Malcolm X, also came out of the Abrahamic religions. This of course released him from the life that he lived before, colorfully described by Manning, Marable and others, including the terrible dyed hair. It seems to me that there are many ways to come at this, but the simple one has been repeated in different ways, which is that in addition to the material struggle of forming a new political order and fighting for freedom, human beings are also creatures of the mythopoetic, and that some kind of logos, some source of meaning, some mythos or logos is required to sustain a sense of who we are in the world, and this has been repeated over and over. What that looks like, what the exact name will be, it's like I'm also kind of trying to get out of the door given the terrible misuse of Ubuntu in especially my field. But I imagine across all fields this terrible treatment of this. But certainly we will need to think, in addition to structures and institutions, what kinds of forms of meaning making are going to be required. My own cosmology is one without God, without a capital T, God, again, and not to Professor Ramos's challenge for a black theology without God, and to ask and wonder what that might mean. At the same time, I'm deeply moved by the Azanian prescript. It's a sin to allow yourself to be oppressed. The extension of these questions, the theological into the political, is a founding or ancient problem that arises. I wanted to just deal also with the question of rest, because I also think that there's a theology in that one as well, after work, rest. And it seems to me that under these sinful conditions, we are not yet ready for any rest, since there's work to be done. Yeah.
So thanks so much. So I would just want to request, if you need to excuse us, you'll do so, but I want you to remain on stage. But I know some of you are pressed for time. Right, so if you need to excuse us, you will do so. Can we give them another round of applause again? Thank you so much. And also express our appreciation to you for your interventions. I think you sharpened a lot of the things. And I'm sure you got the philosophical framework for whether questions are answered or not. So in the way forward, we are going to deal with a number of things. Some of the questions that you're asked, we have a way in which we are going to try and respond to them in the way forward. And I don't want you to have any anxiety about whether this is the last and where we are going. There is some idea on where we are going to take this going forward. Allow us to just have one item, and then we will do the summary and the way forward, because it's important for you to hear what the way forward is. So you see another banner there also on stage from the provincial government of Gauteng. They are supporting this event as well, and they were generous enough to also just become part of this event, because there are some ideas that they have in how they are going to see Professor Masao, how they are going to support and take this work forward. But I want to invite now the HOD and Atenawa to just come and say a word or two on behalf of the Gauteng Provincial Department of Sports, Arts and Culture.
No, thank you very much for this opportunity. I sat at the back with an interest and deep knowledge that we miss. I was saying to a colleague at the back, we're indeed left behind. A lot of politicians who goes to the podium they do emphasize that we should not leave others behind. And I take that this opportunity of today would help us to drag a lot of other people who are not in this podium that you are in. So organizer, we appreciate that you allowed us to plug. We are mandated to what they call create social cohesion, bring people together, create the South Africa we want. But largely is in the books, is APP's performance. So it's a very little line that we're expected to do. And I said to a team, maybe we need to go out and plug where people are and hear how best we can create or bring back what we call social cohesion. So your participation here has been highly illuminating. It helps to open up the department to see how best can we extend this project and work with yourself, Chief, that we can create different platforms, invite young people to take advantage of this knowledge. And more, you'll realize that the response of government is very small because we trap by xenophobia. Tomorrow it's no longer xenophobia, it's something else. So we run after issues, and there's no a very comprehensive way to respond to the bigger issues that you've raised. So, Chair, without repeating what they said, we are keen to work, we are keen to expand these discussions, we are keen to spread them and localize a deeper knowledge so that it does not end in the university, but it goes outside and make Africans to appreciate what they are. And Chief, I to transgress a bit, yesterday I went to visit my old woman in Mohlaking. So, in part, was saying to me, you know, you guys have messed up this country. Zile is better. And so you guys, because so you then put that black people can't own anything. And so the point was made here that ordinary people think we've betrayed this project, Africans, and I'm sure this discussion can help us to unlock the problems we have. In the far right, we also have seen the church being Zionist. We hear people supporting extraordinary things. That people go to say Israel represents what God's want. And it's increasing. I suppose the Israeli government has realized that there's a gap to invite some of the main big churches in the country are also invited to be part of this Zionist project. And I'm sure this part of discussions can help us to resolve the problem. So philosopher, I also think you were too deep. But it's liberating, as we said there, that a lot can be said and help to unlock, but a lot in philosophers end in the university. How do we get them outside and also do these sessions that could help a lot of other young people to appreciate what they are and what they're supposed to be. So that we appreciate. Chair, once more, we're committed, and I'm sure you can guide and say where do we plug, how do we extend this project, part of our mandate is also to do social dialogues. So we should be able to say we can support and get more people to address and fill the halls like this one for people to engage. By that, we want to thank you and we appreciate your invite.
Ndatenawa, can you just use one of those chairs there while we summarize? Thank you, Ndati. No, thank you so much, Ndatenawa, and thank you to everybody who was part of the program our speakers, our brother who delivered that thought-provoking poem as well, our technical team who put everything together. You know, there is a huge team that put all of this together, who are working and continue to work. We thank you so much for that. Now, by way of way forward, okay, Prof left, the Deputy Executive Dean left because I wanted him to hear this, right? So some of the things that came up here is that there are other issues that were also suggested in the online platform that now, you know, we've noted them. So one of the important things for the project that has gathered us here, remember we are gathered under the auspices of a project. The project must take particular note of the issues that come out here so that they inform the work of this project. You know, so we need to strengthen, amongst others, the secretariat of this project. And one of the things that we must do, which came out here, is that we must also look at an action research model that we are going to use, right? Because a lot of you are suggesting that there are practical things that need to be done. You know, one of the methodologies is to use action research, you know, and not become too textbookish in these types of things, because you also then allow communities to impact and interact in your work so that we don't perpetuate the problem of being textbook intellectuals that are detached, you know. So it's one of the things we must look at strengthening. Equally important, we must also see how we link the project with schools, right? With schools. Because one of the tragedies of the era we are in is how the study of history has been devalued, you know? And so this project may also then assist in making sure that we get more and more black young people, especially in public schools, to understand the prestige of history as a subject through the work that all of you are doing. So that could be one of the projects that if we meet next time, we could be meeting in one of the local schools to do this work, you know, and make that something we institutionalize. Meet it in one of the local schools where we do this, and it's something we must think about practically. We, of course, also need to have a clear plan for the calendar year, right? So that whoever wants to support and become a part of this knows in advance what it is we are planning. It is absolutely important so that people don't say, there was an event that was held, I did not know about it, I wish I'd known about it. So part of it makes sure that we must make sure we have a clear plan. And people who are supposed to know about that plan, we must make sure they get to know about it. So we are going to assist the university. We are going to work with the Provincial Department, Sports, Arts and Culture to make sure that we find creative ways of raising awareness about this work and not rely on the traditional ways of communicating and not assume. The last thing is that we must pay careful attention to the venue, you know, that we choose for this type of work. There's a relationship between the sustainability of a project and the venues that you use. So we must really think long and hard about the venue. So for the colleagues who have shared their comments online, there is a team that is working with Ukajenu Ayanda. I've requested them to note those issues that have been raised so that we also assist Prof. Chaka and team to compile a report for what has happened here today. And then that is part and parcel of the process of making sure that we institutionalize this thing. And we must not be shy or afraid to want to create this work into a physical institution. It must not become some desk in some corner and what, you know, because this is one of the things that those who continue to exploit and oppress us have, the capacity they've taken away from, the capacity to build institutions that represent our thinking and our interests. If we continue to fight for inclusion in other people's institutions, everything that we say here is not going to be, we must also understand that once we move beyond the idea of theory, we must also think of building institutions where these very ideas will be protected and housed. On that note, this brings us to the end of this very historic and important gathering. Peace and black power to all of you.